Hi, and welcome to our Human Capital Research Project Materiality Assessment and Evidence Sourcing webinar. My name is David Parham, and I'll be presenting to you on this webinar. I am the Director of Research Projects at SASB, and in that role, I oversee, along with my co-director, Brian Esterly, the activities of our research team. In this webinar, I'm going to cover 4 key areas related to SASB's standard setting process. First, I'll talk about SASB's process to assess the financial materiality of topics in each industry standard. Next, I'll go into a bit more detail on the principles we consider when selecting those topics for inclusion in an industry standard. I'll then discuss the criteria by which we select metrics to go alongside each topic that measure and communicate performance for that topic. And finally, I'll go over how to bring that all together into SASB's process to find evidence to support our standard setting. And in the context of the Human Capital Research Project, I hope that this will be helpful in providing our stakeholders with knowledge of how they can engage with us and as part of executing our research and standard setting projects. So let's go ahead and dive in. And the first thing that we'll look at is our process to source evidence for our standard setting process. The board and the staff rely on our conceptual framework when setting our standards, and this conceptual framework can be found on our website. The presentation will touch on some of the key ideas in the conceptual framework, but for a full understanding, I recommend reading the conceptual framework in its entirety on our website. This pyramid graphic here shows the main elements of our conceptual framework, including our objectives for standard setting, our principles to select topics for inclusion in the standards, our criteria for developing metrics that capture performance on a given topic, and finally, the fundamental tenets that underlie our approach to standard setting. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a quick introduction to our conceptual framework for external stakeholders. The intent is to help introduce stakeholders to our conceptual framework, and in so doing, to support engaging with us more effectively. The Standards Board and the staff utilize all aspects of the conceptual framework when setting our standards, and so it is a very critical document to understand in the context of our work to develop our standards. First, I want to briefly describe the process by which SASB assesses topics for materiality in a given industry. In assessing the financial materiality of a given topic, SASB has a couple key and important considerations. First, we assess the extent to which there is evidence of interest in that topic to a reasonable investor. And second, we look for evidence of financial impacts based on that topic in a given industry. As noted here, we are always looking at these sources of evidence from the context of within a given industry. And of course, we have 77 different industry standards. So let's unpack that a little bit more, and looking first to the evidence of investor interest, how does SASB identify such evidence? So our staff look for evidence that an investor considers information related to a given topic in a given industry in making an investment decision. And the ways in which we look for this type of evidence includes analyzing the impacts of performance on an issue in a given industry on a company's financial performance, the extent to which there are legal or regulatory drivers related to that topic that can impact companies in an industry, the extent to which a given topic relates to competitive drivers within an industry, the presence of stakeholder concerns related to a given issue in a given industry, which may impact a company's license to operate, and finally, the extent to which performance or management of the topic offers companies within the industry an opportunity to innovate and capture value. So these are a few of the ways that we look for signals that an investor would be interested in a given topic based on these types of evidence that the staff analyzes in assessing interest to a reasonable investor. Let's now turn to evidence of financial impacts. How does the SASB staff identify evidence of financial impacts? In this case, we look for tangible examples of actual or potential impact on company valuation or financial performance resulting from a company's performance related to a given sustainability issue. We tie performance on a given sustainability issue through to specific impacts on a company's financial statements and/or its risk profile and its cost of capital. So we're looking for connectivity between a company's exposure to, management of, or performance related to a given topic in a given industry, and how that may flow through to impact different aspects of the company's financial performance, whether it is their revenues, their costs, their asset values, their liabilities, their creditworthiness, or their overall risk profile and cost of capital. So as noted here, it is incredibly important to keep in mind the context of a given industry. And so we consider this evidence on an industry by industry basis. When we think about investor interest, we're interested in we're analyzing the extent to which an investor utilizes performance information to make decisions within a given industry by comparing a company to its peers. Similarly, the connectivity between sustainability issues and financial impacts can depend on the characteristics of a given industry. Again, what are the competitive drivers, the legal or regulatory drivers, the nature of stakeholder concerns, and so on. In terms of how we define industries, I'll refer you to our Sustainable Industry Classification System, or SICS, which is how we define our 77 different industries for which we have developed our standards. And you can find out more about our industry classification system on our website. So let's now turn to, given we have an understanding of sources of evidence of interest to a reasonable investor and evidence of financial impact, how then stakeholders can engage with SASB to provide evidence that may be useful in our standard setting process. So in this case, stakeholders can engage to highlight evidence that falls into these categories above: evidence of investor decision-making based on performance on a given sustainability issue in a given industry, and/or evidence of financial impacts, whether actual or potential, for those same issues. And to the extent possible, this evidence is particularly useful in our process if it is connected to performance through, or if it connects performance through to value drivers within a given industry. So that's a high-level discussion of how SASB considers the financial materiality of a given issue in a given industry. But what do we mean by these sustainability issues? So here we provide a brief overview of the topics that SASB evaluates for materiality. We have 5 broad dimensions: environment, social capital, human capital, business model and innovation, and leadership and governance. And under each of these 5 broad dimensions, we have a number of general issue categories. There's 26 in total, and you can see them listed here. These are the issues that the SASB staff analyzes for financial materiality in each industry, looking for evidence of investor interest and evidence of financial impacts. So for each of these issues, evidence related to these areas within each industry directly supports our standard setting process within each industry. So now that we understand the issues that SASB analyzes for financial materiality and these sorts of evidence that it sources to support the potential for an issue to be financially material, how then do we define disclosure topics based on those issues? And here we'll look at our principles for topic selection in a bit more detail. So turning to our principles for topic selection, those principles are the traits of a topic that topics should generally adhere to. And these include the potential to affect corporate value, interest to investors, relevance across an industry, the extent to which the issue is actionable by companies, and the extent to which the issue is reflective of investor or issuer consensus. So let's talk a bit more about each of these categories. These principles help us further build out the financial materiality considerations that the team incorporates into its process as we select our topics. And this is important. SASB determines the financial materiality of a given issue at the topic level as opposed to at the metric level. So when assessing whether a given topic should be included in our standards, we're looking for evidence of financial materiality for that topic in a given industry, as we discussed in the previous section. When analyzing the extent to which a topic is appropriate for inclusion in our standard, again, we look to these 5 principles. The first is the potential to affect corporate value. Again, what we're looking for here is connectivity between performance on the given issue and the ability for that performance to flow through and impact the company's financial statements or cost of capital. Of interest to investors, of course, relates to the other tenet of our financial materiality approach. And again, we're focusing on investor decision-making, considering financial impacts, legal or regulatory drivers, competitive drivers, stakeholder concerns, and opportunities for innovation. We also look for relevance across an industry. So this would be an issue which is systemic to an industry and which is applicable to many companies in an industry. Of course, that broad applicability is something we see as an opportunity to add value by bringing standardization to the way that companies are reporting on the issue to investors. We also look for evidence that suggests that a topic is actionable by companies. And this is how a broad sustainability trend can be translated into an industry-specific topic that can be actioned by companies in that industry. And lastly, we look to be reflective of investor and issuer consensus. And that's to say that inputs from users of the standards and users of the information generated by the standard are important viewpoints that we include in our understanding of the materiality of a topic. This is, of course, part of our process to develop our standards, in that we are very market informed, which is one of our fundamental tenets. And so we look for evidence from our market participants and stakeholders that the topic is reflective of consensus of its financial materiality within an industry standard. So how can stakeholders engage? To the extent that stakeholders can provide evidence that connects a given topic in a given industry to one or more of the principles described above, this is very helpful for our standard setting process, as it provides evidence that is consistent with our conceptual framework and therefore consistent with our standard setting process. So lastly, we've talked broadly about how and the sorts of evidence that would support the financial materiality of a topic in a given industry. We've gone into a bit more depth on the different principles that SASB considers when selecting topics. And finally, I'd like to briefly spend some time discussing then how SASB selects metrics to measure performance on those topics within an industry standard. So to focus in on how SASB develops our sustainability accounting metrics, as noted, these metrics are designed to measure performance on aspects of each sustainability topic. And this is an important distinction in SASB's conceptual framework and approach to standard setting. Whereas SASB determines financial materiality at the topic level and assesses the extent to which evidence is present to support financial materiality, metrics are designed to communicate performance on a given topic to investors. So if a topic is determined as likely to be financially material based on the evidence that we've discussed previously in this webinar, SASB then develops metrics to capture and communicate performance on the topic. These metrics in their entirety, taken together, where there will be one or more metrics for each topic, taken together, those metrics are designed to capture complete performance on a topic by a company in a given industry. When developing these metrics, SASB considers these criteria for metric selection that are included in our conceptual framework. We consider the extent to which the metric fairly represents performance on that topic, that it is useful for decision-making, both by companies and investors, that it is applicable to companies in the industry, that it is comparable so that you can truly compare on an apples to apples basis performance across two different organizations reporting the metric, that it is complete, as I mentioned earlier, that the set of metrics associated with the topic provide a complete set of information for an investor to understand how a company is performing on that topic, that it is verifiable so that it can be independently verified by a third party, that it is aligned to the extent possible. We seek to find metrics that align with information that companies are currently collecting and reporting. This is part of our overall objective for the standards to be cost effective. The metric is neutral, error-free from bias. And finally, it is distributive in that different companies within an industry may be performing differently on that metric to facilitate investor understanding of performance across an industry and analysis of individual companies performing within an industry. So how stakeholders can engage with SASB related to our metrics development, there's a couple of different ways. First, of course, highlighting metrics that capture performance on financially material topics, and then noting where such metrics meet the criteria that I've just described to you on the left-hand side of the slide. So bringing this all together, I just wanted to briefly touch on the elements that we've discussed here and how the conceptual framework comes together to guide the staff and the board in creating our industry standards. First, we discussed how SASB determines if a topic is likely to be financially material in a given industry. And as we discussed, we look for evidence of interest to a reasonable investor and evidence of financial impact. Then turning to how we determine if a topic meets SASB's principles for topic selection, we discuss these principles listed here, whether the topic is relevant across an industry, actionable by companies, reflective of stakeholder consensus, has the potential to affect value creation, and is of interest to investors. Having discussed how SASB determines whether a topic is financially material and whether that topic meets our principles for topic selection, the next step is, of course, to develop metrics for that topic, and we briefly discussed the criteria that SASB uses to develop those metrics. That the metric fairly represents performance, is useful, applicable, comparable, complete, verifiable, aligned, neutral, and distributive. One helpful way to think about the sorts of evidence that stakeholders can engage with us to provide as part of our standard setting process is this matrix that has been presented here. This matrix helps connect different types of evidence, such as an academic paper, an industry research project, a financial publication, or other publications or other sources of evidence, through to the different types of evidence that SASB considers at various points in its standard setting process. In determining the financial materiality of a topic, as we talked about, there are two types of evidence that we look for: evidence of interest to a reasonable investor and evidence of financial impact. For the Human Capital Project, I'll mention that this is an area of focus for us and an area where we would encourage stakeholders who wish to engage with us to provide evidence that relates to how human capital topics are likely to be material, the connectivity between performance on a given human capital issue and financial performance, and evidence that human capital topics are of interest to investors. This is a key aspect of the framework that we will develop as part of our human capital projects. As we discussed, another set of evidence that is important for SASB's standard setting process are these principles for topic selection, which we discussed. The extent to which stakeholders can help us identify evidence that supports the different principles listed here is highly helpful for our standard setting process. And so just want to reemphasize these principles as and their importance in guiding our standard setting process. And lastly, as we discussed, once SASB has moved to developing metrics for a given topic in a given industry, these are the criteria that SASB considers. Standard setting projects will typically include a consideration of either topics and or metric development. And to the extent that SASB is undertaking a standard setting action that includes the development or revision of metrics, we'd encourage stakeholders to consider these criteria and would greatly value and appreciate evidence provided by stakeholders that helps demonstrate the connectivity between potential metrics that SASB could include in our standards and these criteria for selecting those accounting metrics. So to conclude, I just wanted to again touch on SASB's conceptual framework and remind those who are listening to this webinar that the full details of our standard setting process as defined in our conceptual framework can be found on our website. In this webinar, we primarily focus on the types and sources of evidence that we gather and how this supports standard setting. But of course, looking at the fundamental tenets of SASB's approach, that is one aspect and one pillar of how we develop our standards. But I just wanted to briefly touch on the market-informed piece in highlighting that our process is designed to be an open and engaging process with the market, involving market participants, including investors, companies, and subject matter experts. So of course, another way that stakeholders can engage with SASB is to connect us to participants and to further build out SASB's view and understanding of the evidence that it gathers. So I hope this webinar has been helpful for those who've listened to unpack and provide transparency into SASB's standard setting process as defined in our conceptual framework. As a reminder, we briefly went over the process by which SASB determines whether a topic is likely to be financially material, its principles for those topic selections, and finally, its criteria for selecting metrics for each topic. And we hope this can help provide stakeholders who wish to engage with us with some insight into the process by which we develop our standards to facilitate effective engagement with SASB. SASB is a market-informed organization, as we just discussed, and so we greatly value the feedback and engagement from market participants in our process, as it greatly enhances the value and quality of the standards that we're able to provide for the market. So again, we very much hope this webinar was helpful in providing greater insight and transparency into our process, and we look forward to engaging with you on the human capital and future projects. Thank you.